Good evening, my children of the night. Welcome to Creepy Puppets Presents. I am your puppeteer, Tommy. It's a frosty October night, and I'm warming myself with some lavender-infused Earl Grey tea. And some of my go-to autumn comfort media, Scooby Doo. For those new to my channel, I discuss philosophy, especially when it appears in popular media of late. And two of my favorite philosophical issues related to media, representation, and aesthetic subcultures collide in the newest Scooby-Doo direct-to-video movie, Trick or Treat Scooby Doo. So let's talk about it. Spoilers for the movie, mean comments, and in this case especially homophobic comments, will be deleted. Part 1. The movie summarized. So, Trick or Treat Scooby Doo takes place, it seems like, in the same continuity as Guess Who, based on the art style, and it's definitely in one of the Coolsville continuities, as that's the main setting for the movie. Again, we will do something on continuity probably before Scooby-Doo month is over. The gang have caught and unmasked the latest costume villain, and have determined all the seemingly superpowered monster costumed villains have gotten their tech from a single source, the costume designer Coco Diablo. Coco's design is fantastic. She reminds me a lot of Kida from Disney's Atlantis, and I'm kind of disappointed they didn't ask Cree Summer to voice her. I was sharing in Velma's reaction to the character, is what I'm saying. Anyway, having taken out the monster costume supplier, there are no more bad guys to unmask. The gang basically put themselves out of business. Fred slowly growing unhinged from the boredom is one of the best parts of this movie, and Frank Welker sells it so hard it's great. Eventually, though, monsters return in the form of ghostly doppelgangers of the gang, which in turn causes the gang to go seek to interrogate Coco. Honestly, the monsters are pretty lame. It's one of the weakest parts of the story, but again, I think they exist mostly to set the jokes up and to get the gang interacting with Coco some more. So the gang plus Coco investigate the monsters, who turn out to be robots created by the warden of the Coolsville Penitentiary, who is a big fan of the Mystery Incorporated gang and feels bad over their lack of monster mysteries to solve, so he's set this up to make them feel better. However, in the course of getting caught, the warden accidentally releases all the prisoners, leading to a scene where the gang don the superpowered costumes of some of their original Where Are You villains, doing battle with those same villains, and saving Halloween in Coolsville. Oh yeah, it's Halloween, but that's almost completely irrelevant to the main plot and only exists as a gag subplot about Scooby and Shaggy's trick-or-treating plans, despite, being the title of the movie. Anyway, I have thoughts, so let's start with what everybody cares about when discussing this movie. Part 2, Lesbian Velma. So let's get this right out of the way first. Though heavily implied to be a lesbian in Mystery Incorporated, later confirmed by word of God, Trick or Treat Scooby Doo is the first time an incarnation of Velma Dinkley has been confirmed interested in women on screen after decades of fan speculation. The coverage surrounding this movie has talked about nothing else, and, as we all know, changing or marketing the sexual orientation of a legacy character is a textbook example of fan baiting, and it's usually a massive red flag of poor quality, hoping to get butts into the seeds of controversy rather than a good storytelling. Which, let's be honest, this is the reason Mindy Kaling's Velma will probably suck. So there was a lot riding on this movie to be good. But fortunately, this movie is so good, it's probably in the top 10 Scooby movies to date. Yeah, that's the Cliff Notes take on this movie, but there was also a lot riding on getting the lesbian representation correct, and doing so in a way that wouldn't alienate moderate parents, and in that regard, I think this movie works really well. Velma's crush is pretty clear, but also pretty understated, and maybe a bit too understated. So, like Shaggy had a love ballad for Crystal in Alien Invaders, after all. I think it's what long-term lesbian Velma shippers have been looking for, even though maybe they wanted a little more of it. I don't think moderates were alienated by this too much. Of course, conservatives were alienated by it a whole bunch, but that's a sunk cost at this point. I've seen so many reactionaries on YouTube talk about how this movie is part of a quote agenda to quote indoctrinate our kids, presumably to indoctrinate them to be tolerant of gay people, because how else can we explain the widespread decline of conservative values in our culture without conspiratorial thinking? I talked about this in an old video on conspiracy theories related to progressive leader and spiritualist writer Alice Bailey, but the more logical explanation is actually advanced by conservative philosopher Oswald Spengler. Conservative values just don't provide meaning in people's lives anymore, and that's why people are abandoning them. Gay bad just doesn't make sense in a world where science has pretty clearly demonstrated us queers are born that way. As I stated in my shafting video, I've never been a fan of Lesbian Velma. For much the same reason I don't like Daphne/Fred. There's not a lot of textual evidence for it, making it basically ascended fanon, and it gets in the way of better ships. There are basically two reasons fanon made Velma gay in the first place. Velma's frumpiness, which goes back to the Daphne/Fred problem of these characters should get together because that's the stereotypes they fit, and the fact that Velma is based on a character played by a lesbian actress. Yes, you heard that right. It's a little-known piece of Scooby Doo lore, but the four meddling kids are based on the four leads of the late 50s, early 60s sitcom The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis. Fred's based on Dobie, Daphne's based on Thalia, Velma on Zelda, and Shaggy on Maynard, played by pre-Gilligan Bob Denver. Zelda was famously played by Sheila James Poole, who was later a pioneering lesbian activist. So many stupid reactionary neckbeard YouTubers complaining about how this movie is the first time lesbian speculation has ever existed about Velma. Like, seriously? Fucking reactionaries are stupid. I personally think the Velma/Fred ship is the best ship for Velma in the series, especially since Zelda had a crush on Dobie, followed by Velma being asexual, as there's a serious lack of asexual representation in media. There's also something to be said for the Velma-Johnny Bravo ship, now that I think about it. I also think it slightly undermines the relationship between Velma and Ben Ravencroft from Witch's Ghost, which is the emotional through line of that film. Though the obvious answer here is to appeal to alternate continuities. In some continuities, Velma's straight or bi, and in others she's a big old lesbo. And in the Moog continuity, she's at least interested in men. But hey, if you really want to freak out conservatives, I am totally down with Velma as a trans man, and then you can still put her in the Velma-Fred ship, and now the Fred is gay fans can get what appeals to them. That would be, I think, really fun. Anyway, part 3. The rest of my thoughts on this movie. So yeah, this movie was, other than shipping and animation that is really good in some spots and looks really weird in others, this movie is one of the best Scooby Doo movies in a long time. Though I personally have a soft spot for Happy Halloween Scooby Doo because Scarecrow is my favorite Batman villain. This is certainly better than Return to Zombie Island or Curse of the 13th Ghost. This movie specifically fixes the worst problem with those movies, Kate Micucci's take on Velma. Gone is the obnoxious skepticism, and the extra focus on her character humanizes her a little more. My whole last video was all about why people hate Velma. I think this is the most likable Kate Micucci's take on Velma has ever been, which is probably good for that character. So one of the major areas of disbelief suspension in the Scooby franchise is, why does every criminal the gang encounters do a Halloween costume? And why do those costumes usually replicate the powers of the monsters? There were previously no explanations for this in canon, though Be Cool makes fun of the idea by Fred being placed on trial for creating all the Scooby-Doo hoaxes himself. One popular fan theory had cursed costumes, tempting people like the One Ring into evil and bestowing on them the power of the creatures upon their wearers. This movie finally gives a satisfactory canon answer. Costumed crime was organized and had access to a single costume maker with serious special effects and engineering skills, and when they put her away, the costumed villains stopped, and were left with no more costume monsters. It's a really fun reality ensues moment accompanied by an hilarious take on the theme song. Though if I were Fred, I would have taken the opportunity to investigate paranormal claims and provided the transition to the real monsters half of the franchise's storyline. Which, in fairness, the ending kinda does, but to me it's a little bit of a missed opportunity. Coco Diablo is an amazing character. She's a supervillain who loses, so she's clearly not a flawless Mary Sue reactionary neckbeard YouTube. Some people take issue with basically name a black character Chocolate Devil, and that's fair, But her character pretty clearly takes influence from, like, blaxploitation femme fatales, befitting a show from the 1970s, and her name can't possibly be worse than the similarly blaxploitation-derived Angel Dynamite. Coco already seems to be reaching Hex Girls levels of popularity with the fandom. Like, for what my generation of Scooby-Doo fandom holds the Hex Girls in regard, I suspect the current generation of Scooby-Doo will view Coco. So we'll be seeing Coco again. I can feel that. The soundtrack is also fantastic. I've already talked about the song intro, but one of the characters is Goth, and the soundtrack adds a goth rock montage song so cool I think it deserves its own section. Part 4, Goths in Scooby Doo. So for those unaware, Goths actually began as a fandom of a specific genre of music, goth rock. Goth music diverged from punk in the late 1970s in the UK with the post-punk movement. Bands like Siouxsie and the Banshees, The Cure, Joy Division, and, historically most importantly, Bauhaus. See, in 1962, Jamaica achieved independence from Britain, and many Jamaicans relocated to the UK, especially in working-class neighborhoods in London. The rude boy and skinhead subcultures emerged out of a mixing of Jamaican and working-class white youth culture. Importantly, skinheads back in this time period were not the neo-fascists, but they were the proto-punks. What we today call the Trojan skinheads for the Trojan Records, a company that imported a lot of ska and reggae from Jamaica. Jamaican artists began to develop an upbeat, more aggressive style of reggae with more strong ska influences, known as skinhead reggae, specifically for the skinhead audience. Ska and skinhead reggae would become major influences on classical punk. But another imported reggae subgenre, the heavily electronic and reverby dub reggae, would serve as the foundation of goth, and every other genre of electronic music for the past 5 decades. It literally puts the dub in dubstep. Anyway, so the legendary post-punk band Bauhaus decided to make a dub reggae song about Dracula, called Bela Lugosi's Dead, and almost single-handedly invented goth rock. The fashion developed from the early bands, especially Siouxsie and the Banshees, and emerging 1970s horror trends like the works of Anne Rice. It's interesting to reflect on the fact that Scooby-Doo as a franchise is older than the entire goth subculture. In Trick or Treat Scooby Doo, Coco's assistant Trevor is a goth. He participates in a repairing of the Mystery Machine montage set to a goth rock number, and it absolutely slaps. The lyrics about how one can change your age could be interpreted as a lover changing for their beloved, possibly a reference to Velma's and Coco's relationship. The number also plays us out over the credits. This isn't the first time goths have featured in Scooby-Doo. The Hex Girls and Witch's Ghost are self-described eco-goths, and their fashion fits, but their music is much closer to pop-punk than true goth. So Wicca wasn't the only subculture Witch's Ghost got wrong, but in Be Cool Scooby-Doo, we get a whole episode dedicated to goths, with a goth-inspired score. I like most of goth music. Probably my favorites are Field of the Nephilim, and 15-year-old me was definitely goth adjacent. So both the Be Cool episode and the Trick or Treat movie had me smiling in my dark vampire soul. I'm almost finished with Be Cool, and you know what? Despite its hideous art style, it's hilarious. I'll probably do a full review when I'm done completely, but I think it's probably my favorite incarnation of Grey Delisle's take on Daphne. Part 5, Random Thoughts. So Trick or Treat was better than Straight Outta Nowhere, which I finally saw when it aired on Cartoon Network. I was never the biggest fan of Courage the Cowardly Dog, and I think the tone and art style of both properties clash wildly with each other, but I suspect that was the joke. Trick or Treat Scooby-Doo makes extensive references to the 10,000-volt ghost from the Scooby-Doo show episode, What a Shocking Ghost. I rewatched this episode after watching Trick or Treat, and before the gang finds a room in the ski lodge in that episode, Shaggy mentions the prospect of having to sleep in the cold Mystery Machine. Now, we know the boys are depicted as sleeping outside the van, so I can only interpret this as saying the gang would have had co-ed sleeping arrangements if they couldn't find real hotel rooms. This would, of course, have been off-screen, and sleeping outside in this condition might have been fatal. But for my money, me, it counts as an example of co-ed sleeping in Scooby Doo, at least implied. Another example of implied co-ed sleeping I missed in my video on that topic occurs at the beginning of Alien Invaders. It's never directly shot, but it's heavily visually implied that either Velma, Daphne, and Fred are sleeping together in the back of the mystery machine, or Daphne and Fred are, while Velma sleeps in the back seat. Also, one of my commenters on my co-ed sleeping video pointed out, in the 11-minute short The Hound of the Scoobyvilles, Shaggy and Scooby share one room, while Daphne and Scrappy share another, which implies the dudes being dogs don't count as men in this franchise. But it's also really sweet, given Daphne and Scrappy's sibling-like relationship. Alright folks, that's all for this time. When we see each other again, my friends, it'll be Halloween. Subscribe so as not to miss the conclusion of Scooby-Doo month. Until then, take care, children of the night.